it doesn't really make sense to think that we can achieve dietary perfection or optimization all the time. It really does kind of blow my mind that somebody could say, okay, I am the keto nutritionist. You cannot individualize things optimally if you just kind of stick in this very narrow and specific type of brand. It just doesn't make sense to me anyway.
Why is it important for us to have flexible thinking and then, hat tip to your book, flexible dieting?
Thank you.
When it comes to nutrition and creating or recomping or optimizing for the body composition that we want?
Well, I think that life is just generally a jungle, and we have to be flexible just in general, just to deal with life. And it doesn't really make sense to think that we can achieve dietary perfection or optimization all the time. And beyond that, I think that everybody is so different in their preferences and tolerances and goals. And not only that, but outside of some very specific performance stuff and some high-end type of body composition goals, the body is super resilient in terms of what you can throw at it and still live a healthy life dietarily. And by resilient and flexible, I also mean the body. There's a very wide range of possible macronutrient breakdowns that the body will just equally handle, depending on the goal, both health-wise and sometimes even performance-wise. And there's also a wide range of food selection, food choices that will enable people to live just ripe, long lives, even if they have completely different sets of foods that they enjoy. So the human organism is amazingly diverse and resilient and capable of just almost surviving and thriving on not everything, but on a very wide range of foods. There are certain things that are less negotiable than others, but we'll get there. So, well, that's my first winding answer.
I love that. And I think that I can hear the collective sigh across all the listeners, because there's so much permission in that, because we don't need to be thinking in terms of, black or white. There can be many shades of gray here. So just to highlight this, talk a little bit about what flexible dieting is, and we'll make sure that there's a show links in the show notes for your book, which is available on Amazon, at least last time I checked, and really everywhere. But what is flexible dieting?
Sure, flexible dieting is it's something that is widely misunderstood and misinterpreted and misrepresented. First of all, that's what I think flexible dieting is. Flexible dieting is often synonymous with macro counting, or counting your macronutrient grams. And that is not what flexible dieting is. That is counting macros is a type of dieting. And people have conflated counting macros with an acronym called IIFYM, like if it fits your macros.
Your macros, yeah.
And then what folks have done to take things a step further is conflate if it fits your macros with flexible dieting. And so that's the part that's incorrect. And I don't expect everybody to know that. And that's why I wrote a book about it. And so flexible dieting is, the origins of it are in psychology. So it goes back to 1975-ish, when the concept of cognitive styles of restraint were discussed. So fast forward to the 90s, and now we're talking about cognitive styles of dietary restraint. And so there's rigid dietary restraint and flexible dietary restraint, where rigid dietary restraint views foods and dieting as all or nothing, black or white. And the flexible side of things sees dieting and foods in shades of gray. And so flexible dieting, as we kind of fast forward to the present, is that idea too, a cognitive style of dietary restraint, but also flexibility of dietary approach in terms of how you execute it. Are you more of a quantitative micromanaging person who likes being kind of I guess an accountant with your
spreadsheets.
macronutrients and your spreadsheets and all of that? Or are you more habits based, qualitative? You don't want to bother with the small details type of person. You just want to live your life with some guidelines. We have everybody from all points in that spectrum, and so flexible dieting would say, hey, whatever approach that you want to take is the approach that you should be taking because you prefer it and can sustain it. So it's really how do we individualize the dietary approach? How do we individualize macronutrition? How do we individualize food selection? How do we individualize hedonic allotment, or the junk foods, the fun foods, the indulgence food allotment? And how do we individualize the dieting process to suit someone's proclivity for more of a linear daily caloric restriction type of model, or more of a cyclical dieting or an intermittent energy intake type of model? All of those things need to be individualized. And so going back to the question, like, what is flexible dieting? I would say flexible dieting is really individualizing everything as much as possible so the person can sustain it. And there are wide variations across individuals in all of those aspects that I mentioned that work.
It's been my observation that the more specific the prescription, the more useless it is. So sometimes you'll hear, and I say that sort of tongue in cheek a little bit, because sometimes you'll hear, doesn't matter who, someone online saying something like, you should never, do you know celery? There was a study that looked at celery, and celery is a goitrogen and it has these anti-thyroid, let's say, whatever it is. There's some little piece of this vegetable that, if you consume it, you're going to have a goiter and your thyroid's not going to work. And of course, the amount of celery that you would need to consume in this silly example would be, you wouldn't be able to consume the amount of celery in order to be able to affect those changes in the body. But someone who maybe is not as well read as yourself, who's just sort of looking for the how, like they don't want to know the why and the what, it's just what's the how and what's the now. They'll hear someone say, celery is bad for my thyroid, so I'm not going to have celery. And so I bring that up because I think that there is a lot of dichotomous, there is a lot of black and white type of thinking in the nutrition space. And I think that over time, even my own views, I would say, have softened. So we'll talk about intermittent fasting. I used to be like team IF, like it was like every quarter I am going to be fasting for several days, until I started messing up my menstrual cycle, which maybe we'll get to, maybe we won't today, but very, very, it's very individualized. So I think that the more specific that, my long winding preamble here is, the more specific the recommendation seems to be, the more useless it seems to be as well. So I do like more of a broader, and this is where you kind of get into the expert space. You'll often, if you pay attention to language, which I'm very sensitive to, you'll often hear experts use words like can, maybe, or the illustrative, I don't know. I actually don't know the answer to that, versus feeling forced in a way to be able to provide an answer that fits with the paradigm or the schema that they have set for themselves.
Yes, definitely. And it's like when you think of when you think of being in private practice and working with clients or patients, the whole concept of having a really specific kind of script, a singular, narrow script that you give everybody. I mean, that you're not going to be in practice for very long, right?
Right.
So just kind of coming from a background of having been in private practice for so many years, it really does kind of blow my mind that somebody could say, okay, I am the keto nutritionist, or I am the, blank, whatever you want to brand yourself with, a very specific type of diet. It just, you cannot individualize things optimally if you just kind of stick in this very narrow and specific type of role or type of brand. It just doesn't make sense to me anyway.
Yeah. Well said. Okay, so let's actually move into some of I wanted to just start with that because I think that will paint the picture for the conversation that we're going to have, which is all of the things that we're going to be talking about. I think we can put an asterisk at the end of everything that we're about to say from here on end and say it depends. Okay, so we're gonna talk about protein, and we're gonna talk about carbs, and we're gonna talk about the science of fat loss. We're gonna talk about that, but it's going to really be highly individual. So this is where we can, I often say this, like, I'm a doctor, but I'm not, everyone's doctor. So we can talk about some of these concepts, but of course, speaking with your primary or your coach or somebody who has an in-depth understanding of, let's say, your lab work and your history and your current fitness level, et cetera, is going to be the best person to inform the best care plan for you. All right. So with that being said, you were one of the authors from the International Society of Sports Nutrition, their position on nutrient timing. So yes. I wanted to start here, and maybe actually we'll start with total protein intake. So we'll start with one of the three macros, protein. We'll talk about carbs. I'm sure we'll talk about fat as well. I want to talk about total protein intake. Your position on that, how that contrasts with maybe the RDA, and then maybe we can talk about the acute anabolic window after that. Okay. So total protein intake. So right now, just setting the stage, the RDA, I believe, is it 0.8 gigs per 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. Where do you stand on? I will say that I feel that that's low, even for a sedentary person. Where do you fall in terms of what total protein intake might look like? Is there a range? What do you like to see?
First of all, I'm so freaking excited that you want to talk about this stuff, because who knows, right? But you are a total bro, it turns out. So I'm super excited about this. Okay, so yeah, the RDA, it was put out to the public in 1980, and they've never changed it since 1980. So that's like, is that 43 years? Is my math okay there? So that's one of the big mysteries of, nutrition science, or public health nutrition, at least. Aren't they at least bumping it up to 50% to 1.2, just bump it up, bump the minimum up, because the RDA does not serve large swaths of the general population. So it's insufficient for the elderly, which is the fastest growing population on the planet, pretty much. It is insufficient to maintain the lean body mass of older adults. It's insufficient to maintain lean body mass and satiety in people who are dieting. So anybody who's trying to sustain a hypocaloric condition for weight loss, the RDA is not enough. There's many, many, many studies showing this, just one study after another. And then, we hop on the other side of the fence for people who are trying to gain muscle. The RDA is insufficient. And so, and even for mitigating negative or adverse clinical manifestations, the RDA is insufficient. So it needs to be changed, but it hasn't been changed in 40 years. So everybody's just kind of holding out and almost just sort of giving up and figuring, okay, well, the RDA for protein is just one of those things that's going to stay wrong forever. So we'll just have to stick with the science on this. So Totally correct. And I totally agree with you on the RDA not being enough. And typically, the people who argue in favor of the RDA are folks who just have a tough time getting protein in their diets, or their diets are set up to for protein to be kind of a pain to acquire, you know. And so you'll hear certain factions of folks arguing in favor of the RDA, and more and more vegans are getting onto the science and going, okay, well, you know, maybe you're right. The RDA does appear to be not enough because we've got 12 dozen studies showing it isn't. So, yeah, that's my thought on the RDA.
Well, I think even if we just, again, because I am sensitive to language, I always want to know sort of where words come from. Just the word protein, if we just look at its etymology, Greek from proteos, meaning first quality, or protos, meaning first. So it does need to be the first, in my opinion, first macronutrient that we consider as you sip your protein shake. Well placed, well placed. If you're watching this on YouTube, well done, well done. So what would be, so when we think about, so even you mentioned the elderly, which is a very interesting vertical to think about, because we think about, and this is something we'll talk about when we talk about perimenopause and menopause. But as we age, there is just a general, call it insulin resistance that sets in as we age, and anabolic resistance that sets in as we age. And if there's no strategy, let's say lifting weights or resistance training in some capacity, there's going to be a loss in both strength and volume of the muscle fiber. And certainly, even though strength and mass, we'll say, are different, they actually track so close with each other that they might as well be the same thing. So you should, I always talk to my audience about, I want to be the favorite grandmother. So like when I have, grandbabies, hopefully I'll be blessed with grandchildren. I want to be the grandmother that's able to get down on the floor, play with the babies, tell my sons, don't worry, leave the kids with me. I'll take them to the park. I can run after them. I can get up off the floor. I don't need help. That requires, there's a lot of things that requires: proprioception, ankle mobility, strength in the legs, all the things. So the elderly, it doesn't matter to, I'm just, reflecting back to what you just said. It doesn't make sense that the RDA for someone who is over 60 or 70, that protein requirement doesn't go up. So how do we reconcile even researchers that talk about longevity, and in the blue zones, they say, well, these, if you go to Okinawa, you go to Sardinia, you go to all these places, they don't have a lot of protein. Like they're not throwing back protein shakes, let's say, the way that maybe I am. So how do we reconcile that? Let's say blue zone longevity science, we'll say, with what we're talking about here, which is that maybe we need to overcome some of that natural resistance that sets in as we age.
How do we reconcile the low protein, I guess, fetish of the longevity community? And of course, observationally, you see the blue zones and Okinawa being the famous example, consuming less like 12% of their diet from protein or something to that effect. Well, they're also eating about 10% of their total daily calories from fat. So I would counter that the Okinawans are, well, it kind of goes back to my initial point that we humans are super resilient and we can survive and even thrive on suboptimal habits and routines. As long as enough of the fundamentals are in place, then we can eke our way through. I think that the Okinawans would live even longer and more vigorously and age even better if they carried more muscle and more strength through their older years. I think that the fact that, for example, the longevity champs, the Okinawans, I think that their lifestyle and their longevity is a testament more to staying lean and physically active and having good psychosocial health, good family ties, good sense of fulfilling um, their sense of self-efficacy, their sense of autonomy, relatedness with the community around them and with their environment, and also just having strong spiritual rooting. I think that's an important thing. So all of those things integrate, and they manage their stress levels very well. They feel like a productive member of society, and they just move through life thriving in those departments. So therefore, they can get away with carrying a suboptimal amount of lean body mass, let's say. And when I say suboptimal, it really is kind of it can be disputed because people like the Okinawans and people in the blue zones, they are outliving most of the rest of the world, and they do have less chronic disease than the rest of the world. But I still think that there's a margin of improvement they have available in terms of strength and body composition that will make, for example, their final 20 years of life more vigorous than it is right now. Whereas right now, it may be that they start convalescing in the last 20 years of life. Maybe we can start convalescing in the last 5, 10, or less years of life and just add some really, really good years there where you are running around and where you are carrying the babies, and where you are doing things physically that you did when you were a younger adult. And
Yeah.
so I think there's room for that.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is essentially optimizing health span. It's not just about the years that we live, but it's the quality of the years that we have. And I think that your point is well taken. And I think again, your view is more holistic than, well, how can we just how can we just suppress mTOR activity? Well, we just suppress mTOR activity by not having protein, versus what you're talking about, which is PINE basically, which is like the immune system, the neurological, the endocrinological system, and then the community that we're a part of. I was joking with a guest a couple of weeks ago. I used to think that I could just people when I wanted to, and then, not people when I didn't want to. As long as I had like diet and nutrition and exercise dialed in, like I didn't need people, right? I could just like do my gym workout, get my nutrition in, and like get back to my computer or read my book. And really, it's so important to be connected, to be in a community where you feel seen and heard and understood, like you're just, like you're describing with this population. They have very strong family ties. They probably eat dinner together with each other all the time. There's support. There's not, in North American society, coming back to women a little bit, because that's the demographic that I typically serve. We often, back in the old country, let's say, when you had a child, you'd be living in the same house as your mother and your grandmother. Mm-hmm. And so mom could go and take a nap if she needed to. And then her mom or her grandmother would watch and tend and care for the baby. And so now we live in these big boxes, with these big McMansions, and we're isolated, often live in different cities from mom or grandma, if grandma's around. Mm-hmm. And so I think what you're bringing up is more of a holistic picture, as, maybe that population has a natural ability. Maybe they already have sort of a genetic predisposition to living longer. And maybe that would be optimized with a slightly higher protein intake, potentially. Not, you're not saying absolutely that would happen, but, I think your thinking around that is really sound.
Yeah. And it's one of those programming tweaks that can be made with literally an extra 30 to 40 grams of protein a day. I mean, it's not a big deal. It's totally doable. The whole threat or fear of activating mTOR and shortening lifespan that way, it is totally kind of a, if you can excuse my language, it's kind of an ass backwards way to look at aging well, because the priority for aging well would be to support muscle tissue, support its mass and strength. Anybody who's worked with the aging population, the elderly population, they've observed the effect of loss of muscle mass and strength on basic mobility. And so losing basic mobility is really the beginning of the end for people. And when they can't just even properly get up and down, stand up, from a seated position, or stand up from, or get up from the floor, it's like, okay, this is definitely the beginning of the end. And a lot of these things, we have to think, okay, what supports training performance? I mean, you don't necessarily equate the elderly population with training performance, but you have to, if you want to preserve these individuals in a state where they were 100% functional, or at least push towards that, which is totally possible to turn back the clock in a lot of aspects. Then we have to think in terms of, how do we make these folks stronger? How do we support muscle mass and strength? And the answer is not, oh, okay, well, let's lowball protein because longevity and because we're afraid of activating mTOR. That's totally wrong. What we want to do is make sure people are lean and muscular and physically active. And what supports that? What kind of nutrition supports that? What kind of habits support that? And that's the angle we have to take it from.
Great. One more thing I'll add, and then I want to get back to acute anabolic window, is I think that people really do. I think generally humans think linearly. So we think, well, if I don't get to it now, I'll get to it later. And maybe I'll age at the same rate of decline over time. And I think what I see, or I have seen in practice, is that there is sort of this exponential fall where you don't age at the same rate, in your 40s and in your 50s and in your 60s. There's like an exponential fall off where you just drop the ball. And then, to your point, can't sit, you can't stand up from a seated position. Or if you can do that, you can't, if you're on the floor, you can't stand up and be fully erect, let's say, without using your hands from a seated position on the floor. And that's actually one of the diagnostics. That was one of the tests that I would do for every new patient that walked through the door. It's like, how many push-ups can you do? I was looking for upper body strength, and not knee push-ups, but on your toes. Women almost at 100% of the time, not always, but could only push out maybe one. And there was lots of bowing in the, like no core strength, and it wasn't full range of motion. And then the other test was, can you get up off the floor without using your hands? So for my older patients, it was from the chair. But for a 40 or a 50-year-old, get up off and if they could do that, okay, lie on your back now and stand up. Again, not using your hands.
Not using the hands. That's good.
Yeah.
Really cool test.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that ended up also being the treatment, right? So like the test was also the treatment. So if you can't do that, then that's what you have to work on. And then we'd work on proprioception and ankle mobility and strengthen the legs, et cetera, et cetera.
Very cool.
Yeah. So, okay. So so total protein. So we've established maybe 0.8 grams per kilogram, which is currently the RDA for protein, probably lowballing it for most of the swaths of the population. I like that you said that. Swaths of the population probably missing the mark. Is there a target range that we want to be shooting for?
Yes. And there's sort of two tiers to this. So the first tier would be general population, without any extreme types of goals in terms of body composition or athletics. You just want to be healthy, generally want to be healthy. And that range appears to be 1.2 on the low end to about 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight.
Ideal body weight? Sorry to interrupt you. Ideal body weight, or what they currently weigh?
That's a good thing you bring up, because it's technically, when we talk about protein requirements, we're just assuming that we're talking about people who are normal weight. So for people who are either severely underweight or severely overweight, you would have to go with, in quotes, ideal body weight, or your goal body weight or target body weight. So that gets around the idea that, hey, we should base protein on lean body mass. Well, yeah, well, that would be nice if we could always accurately estimate body composition, but we can't always accurately do that. And so a more pragmatic and simpler and just as good way would be to base protein on either ideal body weight, goal body weight. And of course, if you are at your goal body weight, then it would be your current body weight. So yes, thank you for bringing that up.
So that's for
Yeah.
sedentary individuals, someone who's not, let's say, resistance training 3, 4, whatever times per week.
Yeah, that's kind of the catch-all range for the general population, 1.2 to 1.6. So when this second tier of protein intake, it more applies to athletic folks, recreationally athletic folks, people who are training regularly, and people, and certainly I would say anybody who's dieting, and that would be 1.6 and up. And it's usually, we stop seeing the benefits at around like 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, or a full gram per pound. So really, you've got this 1.2 to 1.6 for the general pop, with not necessarily concerned with, I guess, fine tuning. And then we've got 1.6 to 2.2 for the more athletic population, and people who are running hypocaloric conditions and trying to lose weight. So those are kind of the brackets that we have. And the debates surrounding the higher bracket, is that, gosh, is that realistic? How do we achieve that? It's really hard for me to get a gram per pound. Well, you don't have to get a gram per pound. 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, or 0.7 grams per pound of body weight, or per pound of target body weight. That's going to cover most people, like regardless of where you're at on that spectrum. That 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight appears to be the catch-all, sort of the go-to protein dose if you want to cover everything from preserving lean body mass, to making sure you're good health-wise, to making sure you're good athletics-wise. It would kind of all converge on that 1.6 grams per kilogram, or 0.7 grams per pound.
And actionable, as an actionable takeaway here, we're probably roughly talking about 30 grams on the low end to 50 grams, maybe on the higher end, of protein per meal.
Yes, that's
right.
right.
Have I done my math there? Okay.
Yes, you did. You did. No, that's correct. So the other part of the protein conversation, aside from total daily protein intake, it's like what's the optimal amount to consume per meal, and that varies with the goal, because the first tier of importance is getting sufficient total daily protein. That if you do that, you've gotten 80-90% of the game sewed up. So you don't necessarily have to worry about the other stuff. Now, the protein per meal question comes into play with folks who, like the elderly, who have these just kind of naturally counterproductive habits with regard to protein intake, where they just kind of skip their, like, for example, their breakfast protein will be very, very small, or it won't happen at all. There'll be a marginal amount of protein at lunch, and then dinner is where the big protein hit comes in. And by the time they have that protein, they haven't accumulated enough protein through the course of the day to get their total daily needs. So the protein per meal thing can be a concern and a focus for the elderly population, but it can also be a concern for folks who want to, for whatever reasons, just maximally grow muscle. When your goal is to put on muscle, and that's your main goal, then it can be suboptimal to just think in terms of hitting a total by the end of the day, because some people will have the tendency to just try to get it in like 2 meals, or in some more rare cases like 1 meal. But that's not the ticket to muscle growth. There is a per meal focus, where my colleague Brad Schoenfeld and I, we wrote a paper called "How Much Protein in a Single Meal Can Be Used for Muscle Building." And this is an article that's it's an open access, from the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition, and you can just Google Aragon "how much protein" or Schoenfeld "how much protein," and it should be the first. I know that for Aragon "how much protein," it's the first search result. And so we took a look at all the research on what gives the strongest muscle protein synthesis response, like what protein dose gives the most robust acute anabolic response. And it kind of boils down to about 0.4 grams per kilogram of body weight, all the way to about 0.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. And that's like, about like 0.2-ish to 0.3 grams per pound or so. And it comes down to about 30 to 50 grams of protein. And so if you can get that dose, if you can get that in 4 times a day, then you would equal this kind of magic range, the 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, if you had 4 meals at 0.4 to 0.6 grams per kilogram of body weight. And that's the way you maximize muscle growth. And that's only because there appears to be a ceiling of the acute anabolic response, or of muscle protein synthesis, seems to hit a ceiling at that dosing range.
And I think that this recommendation, certainly I think every woman, irrespective of age, but particularly if you are in perimenopause and menopause, one of your primary goals should be to, at the very minimum, maintain your lean muscle mass, but ideally add to it over time. But I would say, you were describing before sort of these suboptimal habits where the elderly might, have some toast or something in the morning, and then, they have like the steak or the big protein bolus, let's say the last meal of the day. I would say that most Americans and Canadians, which is where I'm up in Canada, that is a very, like, it's the bagel, it's the cereal, it's the muffin with the coffee. This is a very typical standard American, standard Western kind of diet. So if we can start thinking about moving the protein bolus, a bigger protein bolus, at least in the earlier part of the day. And I can say, as a parent, I also notice that when my kids have protein, if they eat their eggs first before I give them their toast, or before I give them their avocado toast or whatever I'm giving them that morning, moods are better. Focus and concentration at school is augmented. And then they get along better. They're just not, I have boys, so it's always a perpetual soccer game in my house. So there's, they're not fighting each other as
How
much
old are
as
your
they
boys?
They're 12 and 10. Yeah. So they're just little rascals, right? Which I love, right? I want to encourage, but I find that it is a very noticeable shift in their emotional regulation and how they interact with people when they haven't had protein first thing in the morning, and then also first thing in the meal. So I will hold the rice back. I'll hold the avocado toast back before they have had their protein. And then once they finish the protein, they get, whatever they want. And then by the time, my little one also has a little bit of a carb, just like is a carb machine, will eat all the cereal if I let him. So it's like, you can have as much cereal as you want, honey, but you just have to have your eggs first. And so when he's done the eggs, magically doesn't really feel like the cereal anymore. Like he'll have a bite or two and then he's full.
Yeah, that's a good tactic, and people don't realize the importance of getting enough protein just throughout the entire life cycle, throughout the different life stages. They'll point to research or they'll point to papers saying that, oh, we got to lower the protein for longevity. And they don't realize that this stuff is based on um, fruit flies and worms and rodents and crickets. I mean, it's like the protein and longevity data set is really not a human data set. And there's just observational data. I believe it was put out by Longo and his colleagues, showing that through middle age, or through younger to older, or younger to middle age adulthood, the protein needs are lower, and then like from 60-ish, 65 and up, it's suddenly the protein needs go up. And this is just observational data. This is not an intervention data. And it's like, well, how about if you kept protein optimal through the whole freaking life cycle? It's
Right.
just like
Right.
some really type of stuff that we're overlooking, and we're in denial because there's this whole low protein narrative running through the longevity community that it really makes no sense.
All right, let's talk about pre-bed protein. And then I promise we're going to get to the acute anabolic window at the timing, because I definitely want to talk about that as well. In the paper that I was talking about as well, your position stand on nutrient timing, one of the things that you talked about, which sort of flies in the face of some, we'll say, intermittent fasting trains of thought, is that consuming protein, I think in the paper you'd specified casein protein somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 grams, can acutely increase MPS over the course of the night without negatively impacting fat metabolism, which I think is something that we don't talk about a lot. I know a lot of, when I was competing, I competed in a figure class of figure competition back before I had children. That was one of the things I had to do in the evening, was have some protein with a little carbs, but like mainly like kind of like a cottage cheese, and I'd put some whatever, like something to sweeten it up or something. Talk a little bit about pre-bed protein and why this is another consideration that we might think about when we're thinking about optimizing muscle protein synthesis and body composition, or increasing lean muscle mass, I should say.
Okay, yes. So, I mean, before I get into that, I'm trying to imagine what year you could have done figure right now. Figure now versus, let's say, 5, 6, 7 years ago. Okay, yeah. Figure in 2008 is bikini now, basically.
All right.
I mean, at least, yeah. I mean, there's just more and more muscle being piled on as the years go on, in the female physique divisions. There's 5 divisions now, and it's just like everybody's just sort of losing track. But yeah, that's cool that you competed, and yeah, pre-bed protein intake was a tactic to preserve muscle mass mainly. And the whole theory behind it was the sleep cycle is just inherently catabolic, because it's essentially a fasting cycle. And so if you could provide a sort of a trickling in of amino acid availability through a slow digesting protein before bed, then you would wake up not in a state of catabolism, but you'd be in sort of this certain net anabolic state where muscle protein synthesis could have occurred overnight. And that's the whole theory and the tactic behind pre-bed protein. And naturally, people theorize that, well, if we have a slow digesting protein, a nice good whack of it before bed, then we would be able to sustain elevations in blood amino acid availability throughout the whole night. And so casein was the choice to do that, because it was a slow digesting protein. It was almost like this IV drip effect. And yeah, as far as we can see, that is a legit tactic if you are on the high end of the goals spectrum, especially a competitor. Having a slow digesting hit of protein before bed is one of the tactics that you can pull. It's one of those stops you can pull to optimize training adaptations and preserve muscle tissue. The fact that pre-bed protein did not reduce like normal fat oxidation that occurs overnight is kind of a mysterious and amazing thing. um, so yeah, it's like it's one of those high end tactics. It's icing on the cake, though, I would call it. It's not necessarily something that would make or break the general population, but for the competitive population, there might be something to it.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about this in the context of intermittent fasting a little bit, and I alluded to this before. This is a position that I've very much softened. You know, when intermittent fasting, I first started becoming very interested in it around 2015, maybe 2016. Wrote a couple of articles on it, and was, you know, it's a relatively new tool, at least, you know, to me at the time. And I guess maybe my personality is such that I was like, I'm all in for this. Like, I am all in for IF. And it's like, I'm going to get the autophagy and the cellular senescence, and I'm going to go all in for that. Of course, you know, maybe overlooking that there are many other ways that you can, you know, start the process of autophagy, lifting weights, one of them. And I just want to read, this is from an article that you wrote, Does Timing Matter? A Narrative Review of Intermittent Fasting Variants and Their Effects on Body Weight and Body Composition. And then I'll let you kind of explain it. Fasting cycles are clearly capable of antagonizing or impeding the maintenance or growth of muscle mass to varying degrees, depending on the length and frequency of the fasting cycle. Further, these findings underscore the crucial dependence of muscle on sufficient energy availability for the goal of maintenance and growth. And so you go on to talk about this 0.4 gigs per kg up to zero point 0.6 gigs per kilogram. And I wanted to read this out and allow you to sort of expand potentially and comment on it, because I often in practice will see the female who is tethered to an 18-6 or a 16-8 fasting, let's say, schedule for herself. Maybe she is under fueling, and maybe she is exercising, you know, tends to be more cardio, but let's just pretend that she's also just lifting weights as well. And this is the individual that I at least clinically see hypercortisolemia. We have change in her fat distribution, where maybe it used to be, or she might even be lean, but she just has more of like that, you know, cortisol belly, we'll say, or more of a ectopic fat distribution. And she's looking to kind of get that down. I wondered if you might comment on, again, coming back to this flexibility of thought around not trying to white knuckle it all the time. Like just because you've set out to do a 16-8, maybe we can be a little gentler.
Yeah. I think that when people try a dietary approach like 16-8, for example, or any of the intermittent fasting variants, you know, whether it's 16-8, whether it's an alternate day fasting type of thing, or whether it's some sort of whole day fasting scheme like 5-2 through the course of the week, they find out, I think typically it takes about a month to see how you take to it. And certainly with women, you have to be able to gauge at least a month so you can compare the same points in the menstrual cycle, how you may be being affected by it. I think that in the beginning, people have to realize that the fasting variants are not something that everybody needs to get on. You know, it's not necessarily an optimal thing to really try to cinch down the feeding window as much as you can, because of the various reasons people read about. You mentioned autophagy. You mentioned like these nebulous kind of clinical benefits of not eating. Well, yeah, they're there, and I mean, the theory is there, but
how do you measure it? How do you measure autophagy?
Right.
As far as I'm concerned, I don't know how you do that.
Right. I mean, you can measure the markers of autophagy. You can measure the protein-based markers, the the autophagosomes, as it were. You can measure various markers of autophagy, but the thing is, autophagy isn't one of these more is better types of things. like you can take the concept of autophagy like too far. I mean, like the crossover point would be a phenomenon called autosis, which is runaway cell death, and that is preceded by autophagy. And so autophagy is something that is better looked at as an algorithm, a physiological algorithm that's just it's running in the background. It's at constant flux, up or down, depending on the various stress vectors throughout the course of the day or the week. The physiological stress vectors like autophagy will just like rise up, it'll ebb and it will flow. Just like, think of another physiological algorithm in the background, glucagon levels or insulin levels. There's this sort of seesaw rise and flow depending on the physiological stress vectors through the day. And so it's not a more is better thing with glucagon, for example, just like it isn't a more is better thing with autophagy. Autophagy is a physiological stress response. It's a catabolic process, and it's necessary for survival of the organism, but it's definitely not more is better. There's a lot of autophagy going on as somebody starves to death, for example. There is a rise in autophagy with any kind of exercise, whether it's endurance exercise or strength exercise. There's autophagy going on. Autophagy is elevated during hypocaloric conditions, whether those dieting conditions are intermittent, like a fasting type of model, or whether those dieting conditions are linear daily caloric restriction. Both conditions elevate autophagy. So the thing to consider with something like autophagy is what people are chasing with fasting and intermittent fasting, is that autophagy occurs with exercise, but the thing about exercise versus fasting is that exercise is generally almost always going to be a win-win. Whereas fasting, depending on the population, depending on the length of the fast, depending on the circumstances, can be a win-lose, particularly as it affects lean body mass. This is less of an issue with the time-restricted feeding models, especially if there's a resistance training program in place. But if somebody is, let's say, they're suboptimizing protein, and they're running a net caloric deficit by the end of the week, and they're not necessarily lifting enough in terms of load or volume, and they decide to alternate day fast, well, you could put lean body mass at risk, and this has been seen in the literature quite a bit. And so fasting, while yes, you are elevating autophagy, it can be a zero-sum game because you're putting lean body mass at box. That we're going for longevity-wise is preserve lean mass and strength, stay physically active, maintain good body composition. And how do you do that? Well, it's not necessarily through just, fasting. So yeah, I kind of went off there a little bit. So bring me back, Stephanie.
I appreciate it, because I also, one of the things I think we need to be thinking about in addition to preserving muscle mass is also bone density, which is also, you have too much osteoclastic activity, again, a catabolic process relative to osteoblastic activity. And you're going to find that your bones are going to be weak, and they're going to be more likely to bend and fracture and break. And certainly as you are moving into, a lower, in menopause, when you're moving into a lower, the hormonal environment, let's say the hormonal milieu that you're living in, you have less anabolic hormones anyway. So you have less testosterone net, you have less estrogen net. We have to really be thinking about preserving muscle tissue, but also the scaffolding, right, that holds up the muscle tissue, which is the bone. So I agree with you, where I think that when we're always thinking about spring cleaning, you do have to give your body substrate. And it's interesting, even with, women that I work with who are looking to lose weight, when we start feeding them more, they've been on these like 1100 calorie, whatever diets forever. And then you start giving them, and they're like, I can't believe it, but I'm lighter on the scale, like a couple days in. And it's like, yeah, well, you're giving yourself substrate that your cells can actually use. So now you're not getting rid of, let's say functional active tissue, like, your muscles or your organs or your bones. Right. So I think that, and maybe this is a separate conversation. I'm going to bring it back to the acute, anabolic window. I promise we'll get there. But I do think that it's worth mentioning, and I will continue to mention this on the podcast, that we can't, as women, certainly there's if you're in a caloric surplus and you don't have the lifestyle to support that, of course, we're going to accumulate excess. We're going to accumulate adipose tissue. We're going to accumulate things that maybe we don't want to be. But I think that when you are lifting in particular, which is something that is, it's something that I cherish, not only for, the gains with the Z, right? It's not only for like being able to, it's not only to be a bro, but it's also like, I cherish my time at the gym, like the mental benefits that I have. The other day, we just had the time change. Did the time change where you were? Where are you? Where are you located?
I'm in California. So yes, we did just have the daylight savings thing.
Okay. So by the time this podcast is produced, this will be a bit of a moot point, but I was annoyed the next day because I didn't have enough time to do my long workout. I had soccer duty with the boys and stuff. And so I was pissed. But I went down, did the workout. And sometimes when I'm working out, I have space for that. We'll call it sacred rage, right? Because there's no other real place for that to come out, right? Except at the weights in the weight room, right? I love weights for that. So
it's so funny. I tease my wife. I'm like, you're a high test woman, aren't you?
Speaking of your wife, I have to say, I've never met her, but hot damn, she is 50 and she is a absolute goddess. Like she is really redefining what it means to be a woman in her 50s. She looks fabulous.
Oh gosh, thank you so much. And I'll relay the message. She'll be thrilled to hear that you said that. So, you brought up osteoporosis, and 80% of the osteoporosis cases in the general population are women. And that's a big problem. And a lot of osteoporosis would relate to a lack of energy availability and nutrient availability through the lifespan, because it is a cumulative thing where you're putting money in the bone bank throughout your life. And so very important. Nutrition, protein, micronutrition, and resistance training throughout the lifespan is super important.
All right. So when I was doing figure, which is now maybe not even bikini, I don't even know. It was I was in New York. I was, who was it that I competed with? NPC was the, I don't even think they're around anymore. So I did like the tri-state, what have you. Anyway, when my coach was like, listen, as soon as you're done weight training, you have 15 minutes, like you have 15 minutes to get some protein and some carbs. So I would finish my training. I'd literally go to the juice bar, order the protein shake, and like run to the change room, change, and then come back. So I could get in this like protein bolus, carbohydrate bolus within 15 minutes of finishing my training. We were talking earlier about total protein over the course of the day, and then nuancing it a little bit further for those of us who are looking to optimize for muscle protein synthesis and lean muscle mass, that maybe we want to be thinking about nutrient timing and spreading that bolus or spreading that dosage, let's say, out over the course of the day. For those of us who are resistance training as well, is there an acute anabolic timing window where we have a certain amount of time where the muscle, let's say, is more receptive to substrate for remodeling?
Yeah. So that post-exercise anabolic window concept, we have to kind of go back into history and let's talk about how it came about and how it evolved into the physical culture, because it's important to know those things to be able to understand why everybody's trying to get that that whey and dextrose down, as soon as possible afterwards. So this is rooted in research back in the late 80s by John Ivey and Robert Portman, where they were looking at the rate of glycogen, so glycogen being the stored form of carbohydrate in the muscle and in the liver, but in this context, stored carbohydrate in the muscle. How can we resynthesize that? How can we restock that as quickly as possible once we've depleted that? So what they did was they would compare two groups of people. So this is after an overnight fast, they would deplete glycogen in both groups. So they would put them through almost 2 hours of continuous moderate and high intensity cycling, almost 2 hours of it, tap out glycogen in the quads, and then measure the rate of glycogen resynthesis from either immediate carbohydrate intake, like a substantial amount of immediate carbohydrate intake, or a significant delay in carbohydrate intake, let's say a 2 hour delay, 3 hour, 4 hour delay. And they would just measure the rate of glycogen restocking in those two models, the immediate carbohydrate model and the delayed carbohydrate model. And predictably, if you delay carbohydrate intake, then at, let's say, the 4 hour mark or the 8 hour mark, you may have significantly less restocked carbohydrate or glycogen within the muscles. So the importance of this and the application of this really only comes down to endurance athletes who rely on glycogen availability for exercise performance. And this really only applies when you look at a short time frame, like 8 hours. That really only applies to days where you have more than one glycogen depleting event, like a multi-stage endurance race, like triathlon, for example. So the original post-exercise anabolic window had everything to do with restocking glycogen as quickly as possible, because number one, you depleted it in the first place with an exhaustive endurance type of activity. And secondly, you were going to use those same glycogen depleted muscles within the same day to compete again. So that is the root of the post-exercise anabolic window. It had everything to do with endurance competition. And so what happened from that point was John Ivey and Robert Portman et al. Started looking at post-exercise protein and carbohydrate and how that affects muscle protein synthesis. And so what they like a small amount of protein and a large amount of carbohydrate, then you can elevate muscle protein synthesis to a higher degree than having carbohydrate by itself. And so they're saying, aha, so now we know how to restock glycogen as quickly as possible by having a highly glycemic, or highly insulinic carbohydrate source ASAP after training, and that will restock glycogen the fastest. And now we're looking at muscle protein synthesis, which should kickstart the recovery and growth process of muscle tissue. And so, hey, we've found the holy grail here. What you need to do is have a quickly digesting protein and a quickly digesting carbohydrate source, and hopefully optimally in this liquid solution as soon as possible post-exercise. Because if you miss that window, then you're going to compromise recovery, you're going to compromise growth, and you're going to compromise just the optimal adaptations to training. And so that was the theory. Okay, so that was back in the early 2000s when they put out their book Nutrient Timing, when Portman and Ivey put out their book Nutrient Timing. And so what happened from the early 2000s to the late 2000s, starting to breach the 2010s, what happened was a series of studies that essentially tested out that hypothesis, the anabolic window hypothesis. And the way that they tested it out is they compared different timing schemes of protein relative to the training bout. So, whereas it was a known thing that glycogen restocking happens maximally if you don't wait and you have a highly insulinemic, highly glycemic carbohydrate source, what wasn't strongly established was the protein timing thing for muscle growth. So from the early 2000s to the late 2000s, we tested this out through, not my group. My group actually came in 2013, 2014, and we started testing this out after we saw that the results were inconsistent. People were growing just the same, whether they consumed protein immediately after training or whether they waited, a couple of hours to have their protein after training. They were having the same degree of muscle size and strength gains. And so my colleagues and I, we took a look at all the research, like over a dozen studies that looked at protein timing and the so-called anabolic window. And we found that it actually didn't matter when, relative to the training bout, that you consume protein, as long as total daily protein was 1.6, 1.7 grams per kilogram of body weight. And so, for the listeners, a meta-analysis is when you look at multiple studies and you pool the findings together, you pool the results together, and you get kind of an aerial view or a read on what direction the evidence leans. Is it leaning in favor of the narrow post-exercise anabolic window, or is it not? And we found that it didn't. And so what my colleagues and I did was we decided to test out that idea directly. And so we ran a randomized controlled trial that compared immediate pre-exercise feeding with immediate post-exercise feeding of protein, of 25 grams of protein within a liquid MRP type meal. So it was protein and in a liquid, quickly absorbed form. And there was no difference in muscle size and strength gains over a period of weeks with immediate pre-exercise protein feeding versus immediate post-exercise protein feeding. And so
any subjective performance differences?
No, no, not even that. The strength gains were the same. And by the way, we also did a study that compared fed cardio with fasted cardio on body composition, and we found no difference either.
And no difference.
So that's kind of an aside.
There you go.
Yeah, no difference with fed and fasted cardio. But so, all right, so back to this anabolic window concept, the post-exercise anabolic window concept. We always kind of doubted it, for one, because the studies from the early 2000s to the late 2000s were showing that it doesn't matter. And number two, when you think about the timing of your meals, you're really shooting to achieve nutrient availability in the blood. So it's not about when you actually consume the food, it's when those downstream metabolites, those nutrients, when they show up maximally in blood circulation. And so whenever you consume a meal, those blood substrates are going to become maximally available in at soonest, 45 minutes. So about an hour is when amino acids peak in the blood after a good hit of protein. So we're thinking, gosh, why are people so focused on the post-exercise window and getting it in like what you experienced within 15, 30 minutes of your workout, when you do that, those substrates are going to peak in the blood an hour later.
Right.
So it's more like, if you want to take advantage of the anabolic window, then think more in terms of substrate availability in the blood. So like the pre-exercise meal, if you have, let's say, 30, 45 grams of protein. Let's say a quickly digesting protein that who is going to have amino acid levels peak in the blood like 45 to 60 minutes later. If you have that pre-exercise, then that kind of becomes the post-exercise meal. If you have it immediately pre and your training bout is about an hour, then you've kind of created this ideal post-exercise
Right, because it's
environment.
available once you're done. I love that.
It's available once you're done. And so what we concluded is that, look, if you want to nitpick and you want to take advantage of these temporal opportunities to optimize nutrient availability, then you would basically stick your workout in between two nutrient doses, in between two protein-rich meals. That way you're covering all your bases. If you really want to, if you really want to pull all the stops. And so I have this. I said this on the forums, and it kept getting quoted. So if you're still burping up your pre-workout meal when your workout is over, then chances are you don't need to run to the locker room and slam your whey dextrose shake, right? Because you've already created this anabolic environment post-exercise with your pre-exercise meal. So just kind of boiling things down to practical terms, it's like the peri-exercise period, in quotes, is the period between your two protein feedings. Okay, that the pre-exercise protein feeding and the post-exercise protein feeding. And we're talking protein now because carbohydrate is mainly it's more of an endurance type of thing, mainly an athletic performance type of thing, where glycogen is depleted. And with resistance training, you'd be lucky to tap out 40% of your glycogen, even with a decently high volume of sets. So the peri-exercise period, try not to stretch that out more than I would say 4 to 5 hours, 6 hours at the most, if your goal is to gain muscle. So the exercise bout would be in between, in the peri-exercise period, which is framed by these two protein feedings. Try not to stretch that peri-exercise window more than about 5-6-ish hours. And that's really all you need to care about. You don't have to care about this narrow 30-minute, 45-minute, 60-minute post-exercise anabolic window. Although I would add to that, Stephanie, that the people who do slam their whey dextrose shake post-exercise, they're not doing anything bad. They're not harming anything. It's just that it's not necessarily doing anything better than just having a regularly scheduled set of meals. Yeah. So, I mean, it is an opportunity to feed. It's an opportunity to get nutrients in, and it's never a bad thing, but it was just unnecessary. And so you could drive home in traffic and eat your steak and potatoes instead of, having your whey and quick carb source at the gym. You could actually drive home and eat your normal meal and still grow just as fast.
So I have 3 questions now that you've said that.
Yeah.
I had 2 and now I have 3.
Okay.
So does that suggest, so the exercise, I'm thinking of the woman like myself who I go to the gym before my kids wake up, and I'm back before they wake up. So I'm at the gym relatively early in the morning. So I'm thinking about other women that may say, well, the only time that I have to work out is in the morning. And I don't necessarily like to have a pre-workout. Like myself, I do find that eating, at 4:45 in the morning, it's just not, I don't have an appetite at that time. So I throw back some coffee and then I head over to the gym with some water or whatever. Usually maybe some electrolytes in it. So for that woman, asking for a friend, asking for myself, and also for the other women who work out in the morning, is that pre-bed protein then, does that become more important so that we're kind of sandwiching, let's say, the first thing that you do in the morning is your resistance training or whatever movement program that you've designed for yourself. And then you have this pre-bed protein and then that post-workout feeding window. So then you're making sure that the two protein boluses there are going to be sufficient enough to be able to give the muscles what they need for reparation.
That's a great point. And just thinking about it on the spot, I would agree with you. I would say yes. And I'd also, just put out the reminder that when we're talking about the peri-exercise period and not stretching it out more than, 5-6 hours, that's for somebody with the main goal of muscle growth.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like maintenance of muscle tissue. And if you don't necessarily have goals of muscle growth, then you wouldn't have to worry about that. So, like for example, in your case, if your sole mission in life was to put on muscle as quickly as possible, I would encourage you to have a quick dose of protein. Maybe
could you do it during the workout? Like
you could do it during the
something?
workout. Yeah, you could do it during the workout. You could throw some whey into a solution. But even then, as I think about it, it's like the way the body works. If the way that you described, you're probably going to have a stronger anabolic response to your post-exercise meal than somebody who, let's say, ate some breakfast at 4:45 a.m. And we know this because there's a 2010 study by Del Dique and colleagues where they looked at anabolic signaling with a fasted training bout versus a fed training bout. They looked at the anabolic response to the post-exercise meal. And the anabolic response to the post-exercise meal under the fasted training conditions was significantly stronger because the body kind of, it sort of senses this sort of energy and nutrient crisis. And so it's going to sponge up nutrients and ramp up anabolic processes a little bit harder in the case of fasted training. So it all kind of comes out even because
it's kind of what we were talking about at the top of the hour, right? It's like you can give the body a whole different whack of circumstances and you're going to have for the most part, an appropriate response most of the time, given a myriad of different scenarios.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
The other question I had was, where does creatine fit in? So this is something that I always have in my post. There's like the protein. I usually have some oats or something. And then there's some creatine in my creatine monohydrate in the shake. Does it matter again, pre-post? Is it just that peri-exercise window again that you're referring to that really matters, that you're getting enough creatine over the course of the day, or, I guess to saturate the muscle cell and then just the maintenance of it?
Yeah, the answer to that question is a little bit nuanced because when it takes some time, like let's say somebody's never supplemented with creatine before. So it takes some time for the muscle creatine stores to become loaded or saturated. So that's achieved by either this loading phase, the classic loading phase where you do 20 to 25 grams for a week for 7 days. And then your muscle creatine stores are saturated by the end of that week. So if you do that and you get that loading phase expedited and done and out of the way, then the timing of your creatine maintenance dose, that 3 to 5 gram maintenance dose, doesn't matter because you're already saturated. Now, if you want to expedite the saturation process, then there's a little bit quicker saturation that happens when you have the creatine post-exercise. But then again, that doesn't matter once you're saturated. So
okay, good. I love that.
Yeah.
So I've gotten to my second question. So we did talk about the anabolic window as we were talking pre-chat, and I have a whole list of things. We're definitely going to have you on for a second part of the show, but maybe we can finish with our time together talking a little bit about just following on this idea of protein and the protein hierarchy. So we've been talking about protein powders, right? Or, well, I've been talking about protein. I hope we've both been talking about protein powders, because the post-anabolic, like my post-exercise is a protein powder. But what are sort of the top tier, if we're thinking about top quality, good quality protein sources? Do you think about it like top tier? These are the best ones that we want to be thinking about. I know there's been some discussion, and I believe it was Brad Schoenfeld who was talking. I haven't read the study yet, but he was talking about a recent study that he was talking about on Instagram, and it was like, oh my gosh, I can't even read these comments. Like, this is sometimes the comment section. I feel like you need to have to pay to make a comment, because I feel like they would change. But he was talking about these two groups. They were intermediately trained them for 10 weeks. One was animal protein, one was plant protein. Mm-hmm. The net was no difference. So there was no net difference in I think it was strength and net muscle mass gain between the two. Mm-hmm. And they had, I think the only confounding variable potentially was that they were both supplemented with creatine, although you can make an argument for that either way. So at the risk of pissing everybody off, animal and plant protein. So I've been asking since he put, I was like, okay, I have to sit down and read this study, because it really has shaken my understanding of animal versus plant protein. And I've been having sort of this like private conversation with Simon Hill. I'm trying to get him on the show because I would love to have his perspective on it as well. Who is very much like, you can have whatever, and he sort of biases towards more plant proteins as more of maybe a viable option for longevity. But I would love your opinion, because I've always held the premise that animal proteins are superior to plants for bioavailability, for caloric consumption, for the full complement of amino acids. But it seems like this study flies in the face of that. It seems like doesn't seem like there's a negligible difference. I would love your thoughts on that.
Well, let's first start off by ribbing Simon. Oh, Simon, he's such a nice feller. He's such a hippie.
Tree
so
hugger.
yeah, he's hugging trees. He's getting real strong and jacked from them trees. So that study that you mentioned by Montaigne and colleagues, that recent study that just got published, I was really initially I was really excited to hear about it, because I was anticipating that they would kind of upgrade from the limitations of the previous study done by Hevia, Lorraine, and colleagues in 2021. And so going back to Hevia, Lorraine et al., they did essentially the same study, but without creatine and a different protein source to supplement. So they supplemented their folks with soy protein. They fortified the vegan group with soy protein isolate, I believe it was. And the strengths of that study were that they finally did a resistance training study, a progressive resistance training, comparing full vegan with an omnivore group. So the studies prior to Hevia, Lorraine, and colleagues comparing or investigating the plant protein versus animal protein question typically just compared two different omnivorous regimes, one supplemented with a plant-based protein and one supplemented with an animal-based protein. Like it's usually like soy versus whey here, okay?
Right.
But they're both omnivorous, so you're only looking at one or two protein doses in the day being either plant or animal. So it's not really answering the vegan versus omnivore question. So we only have two studies answering the vegan versus omnivore question in the context of progressive resistance training designed to maximize muscle hypertrophy and strength. So, but mainly muscle hypertrophy. So we only have two studies, and the study that you alluded to is the latest one, and it really is kind of a bummer that they used creatine in this study, because the addition of creatine does a couple of things that that leave open questions. They don't close the loop on what we're wondering about things. So, all right, creatine is an anabolic factor that you're adding to the mix. Creatine is a known robust anabolic agent. I mean, it's really the only supplement that robustly works. It's only legal supplement that robustly works for augmenting muscle size and strength gains. And so when you add that into the mix, then you're really, you're introducing this agent that can potentially mask the smaller effects of differences in protein type. So not only do you have the potential to mask those effects, but with creatine, 20 to 30% of humans are non-responders to creatine supplementation. So, and this can be through a variety of different reasons, but before, getting into that, if there were more non-responders or more responders on one group versus the other, so if there was an uneven split of responders and non-responders in the group, that can introduce confounding variation or noise to the study. Mm-hmm. So you're, it's perfectly fine if the aim is to look and see if creatine, we'll see what that does. Okay, great. But you're going to need another group in the study that is not on creatine, or another two groups that aren't on creatine, so you can test two different protein types. I would say that they should have just left creatine out of the study, so we can do what the study aimed to do, which was compare protein sources. And so the authors said that, okay, we're putting creatine in here to level the playing field, because the creatine content or lack of is the main handicap of the plant-based protein. So therefore, let's level the playing field there and then compare it. I'm thinking, why not see if the mycoprotein is a fungus-based protein? The trade name corn, Quorn, that's what they fortified the vegan diet with. Why not see how that stacks up against the omnivorous diet without creatine? Because not everybody is going to be, not everybody can do it just, economically, and it's not always even available in stock nowadays. So why not make the study more generalizable, more externally valid, and frankly, more practical, make the findings more practical. But now we can't confidently say that the playing field was leveled because mycoprotein is such a great thing. We have to go, maybe creatine masked the effects, or maybe there was an uneven split of responders and non-responders in the group. So once again, like I was saying, we're left with a bunch of questions now because they added the creatine. And then there's another factor that needs to be addressed. So the issue of training status is another thing that people will debate. People will debate the crap out of that too. Mm-hmm. And let me tell you, of course, vegans are going to want to wave around the new Montine et al. Study, and of course the Heavy-Lorraine study as, we got you guys, we got you guys. All we need to do is consume enough total protein, and then it doesn't matter what the protein sources are, plant or animal. Okay. Well, the nuance and the caveat to that is, with this latest study, they used this fungus-based protein, this mycoprotein, or brand name corn, and corn might be a special kind of protein. Mycoprotein might be a particularly anabolic plant-based protein, because there's acute data showing that it raises muscle protein synthesis to a higher degree than milk protein. And so, you know,
Wow. Okay.
and
But
so
that's not readily available. That's not a Vega or that's not a readily
yeah,
available, let's say, plant-based protein that someone might just go to the shop to get.
yeah, no, it's not. It's not. And it's costs 2 to 3 times more than whey per gram of protein.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so when people make these generalizations based on this recent study, you have to realize, well, that might be a little bit hasty because we're looking at a specific type of protein that the diet was fortified with.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we have the that confounding variable of creatine added to the mix.
Right.
And then the other factor that we need to talk about is training status. So you can take untrained subjects and run an experiment where you're going to test two different protein types. Well, you're kind of screwed from the beginning because untrained subjects are going to make these robust newbie gains regardless of the nutritional protocol. So if you're testing these sort of fine-tuned differences in the food selection, in the protein source, then use trained subjects, use resistance trained subjects, preferably use highly trained or decently trained resistance trainees who've been at it for regularly for at least a year, and then run the experiment and see if there's something special. So right now with the studies that we've got, we have the problem of potentially untrained subjects. So in Montine and colleagues, this latest vegan versus omni study, the eligibility criteria for participating in the study is you had to have had 6 months of resistance training experience within the prior 3 years to the
Oh,
start of the trial. So it's like, oh man, come on, man, come on, bro,
yeah.
you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so those are my issues with that. And okay, so now the strengths of the Montine and Colley study, they pulled out all the stops. I mean, they measured muscle fiber size. They had a 3-day initial phase before the 10-week longitudinal phase where they measured muscle protein synthesis. They made sure that total protein was equated between groups at an optimal level. So the target was 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, and the subjects ended up eating closer to 2.2 I believe it was 2.1 to 2.3 grams per kilogram of body weight that the subjects ended up eating. So that all of that was definitely optimal, but we're still left with those issues. And what I would take home from the existing plant versus animal-based protein studies, which we have two to really sink our teeth in. Some people bring up another study called the swap meat study, which was omni versus vegan, but there was no progressive resistance training program in there. There was just push-up, basically local endurance capacity. So we can leave that study out of this particular conversation. I would say that it's still unanswered. I mean, it's looking good. It's looking good for vegans who are willing to make sure they consume 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight and up. If you're untrained, if you're not necessarily highly trained, it's looking just fine. And a lot of the general population is not going to be these trained folks that we're seeking out to put in these studies to see if there's anything truly special about one type of protein or another. But there's also the issue that, okay, there's more to life and health than seeing how much protein, how much muscle a given group can gain in 10 to 12 weeks. What does the long term say? I mean, what are people missing out on nutritionally or micronutritionally, and not even essential nutrient wise? Mm-hmm. What are they missing out on by avoiding all animal foods? What are some of those factors that might come into play with either optimizing or sub-optimizing the aging process? Now, I'll be the first to admit that, along with these potentially beneficial compounds in animal foods that you're not getting in plant foods, you're also getting the potentially adverse compounds in animal foods that you're not getting in the plant foods.
Correct.
But there's a way around that. and there's a way to optimize it. So I'm I'm 51. I keep forgetting. I keep thinking I'm just going to be 50 forever. I'm 51 and I don't see myself going vegan anytime soon. Why? Because I call me selfish. I don't want to suboptimize uh, optimal aging. so so yeah, that is something that's going to piss people off, and that is going to anger your vegan audience. But I am
I
not
don't really have a
sold.
vegan audience. They just show up on my Instagram.
Oh, nice.
I don't really have a vegan audience, but I am sensitive. I am sensitive to the vegetarians and the, I've tried to, I guess my clinical concern around someone who's a long-term vegetarian or long-term vegan is some of these nutrition deficiencies that we almost invariably always see, like B vitamin status. We see a whole complement. Iron is usually an issue. There's usually thyroid issues that sort of go along with long-term, we'll say, meat restriction or leaving meat out entirely. That's what I often find. B6 and B12 nutrient deficiency. I find all of these different things. So in some ways, I think, and it depends on the person. Certainly, ethics and religion and cultural sensitivities, I think, are important. But if someone is willing to, at the very minimum, if they are experiencing, I've had women hair falling out, and the most common story that I often see is that someone moves from like whatever diet they were following before, call it the standard American, whatever it is. And then they move into vegan and they feel great because they are having all of these whole foods, right? They're having lots of plants, they're having all the, the xenohormetic effects that come with that and the polyphenols and all the things. And then they sort of ride the wave. They ride sort of the arc of benefits. And then they sort of find themselves on the other side of the U curve, where it has gone from being a therapeutic intervention to being maladaptive. And I would say that this happens in the keto community as well. I talk a lot about the ketogenic diet. People feel great on keto. They drop a lot of initial water weight and inflammation goes down, and then they ride keto for way too long. And then what ends up happening is people say, oh, I'm not doing it the way I was when I first started. I just have to do keto. I have to get stricter with myself. I have to do veganism more, or whatever the intervention is. And then what's happened is you need to, the diet that worked for you, let's say when you were metabolically ill or hormonally deranged, or there was some weight loss, whatever objective, is not necessarily the same diet that you need to follow when you have rid yourself of those ailments. So that's where I sort of fall on it. And I think that veganism, yes, like keto, can be good as a therapeutic intervention temporarily. And I, like you, I enjoy steak, probably too much. And but I'm also okay with that. I've made peace with the idea that there's another life that's helping to sustain mine, and I'm very grateful for it. And, I think that there's a conversation, Rob Wolf on the show has talked about regenerative agriculture and how we can have these sustainable, maybe more ethical practices around meat in general.
When you talk to people in the space, like from all ends of the spectrum, there's even when you talk to the carnivore folks, a lot of them are ex-vegans. And right, one of the reasons obviously would be that, some people have a tendency to just gravitate towards extremes. They just right, can't do anything within the gray scale. And then there's also, there's also the distinct possibility that with some people, maybe a lot of people, no matter how much you think you're supplementing the shortcomings of a completely animal-free diet, you simply are not going to be getting the health effects that you're looking for. And a lot of folks have expressed this, and a lot of people have exited veganism because of this. And that's just a reality. You can explain it away, and you can, if you're a vegan evangelist, you're going to have these reasons and these potential solutions of how to actually achieve that. Get all the supplements in there. But the fact of the matter is a lot of people tried and it didn't work. Mm-hmm. And they did feel better and their health did get restored from including animal foods into their diet. And so that is just the reality of the matter. And you know what? I don't see a lot of vegans who are parents with kids. I think they're, they're kind of focusing on these things that that people with pressing human concerns are a little bit preoccupied with.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that I don't know. I mean, that may be a value judgment, and it's something that is sort of off the side. But yeah, animal versus plant protein, I'm not convinced yet. And if there was a high stakes client or athlete that I was working with, and if he or she insisted on being vegan, I would still give them 20%. I would still assign them about 20% more protein, total daily protein, than I would an omnivorous person, just to err on the safe side. And there's other things to talk about there. I mean, collagen is an animal source food that vegans aren't getting. And there's research that's piling up on why that might be a bad idea to have a collagen-free diet. And so, yeah, there's different things that we can talk about with that too.